Hello, everybody. Come through to the CHRO webinar. Please introduce yourselves. Let us know which organization you're with, what role you're in. And then as soon as we have enough people in here, we can get started. Hope everybody's feeling good, positive on this sunny Wednesday morning in my part of the world. Hope you guys are all good. All right, we've got some decent numbers. I think we can start. Welcome again to the CHRO webinar, where today we'll be discussing how to use data to achieve your DE&I objectives. My name is Suguna Kabinde, and I am currently the community manager at CHRO South Africa. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please adjust your chat to ensure that you're addressing your questions and comments to all attendees and panelists. By default, the chat function only allows you to address comments to the panelists, which means other people in the webinar won't be able to see them. And then at least two people repeating questions and things like that. So please be sure to set it to panel attendees and panelists. Or I think it actually says everyone now, not attendees and panelists. So please do that. And then let's get going. We'll be introducing the topic of diversity, equity and inclusion rather, which is a topic that has gained a lot of traction over the past couple of years and impacted by COVID-19, which has brought matters of equity even closer into the spotlight. Furthermore, the pandemic has increased the volume and types of data that organizations are collecting. Namely, Mercer in particular has been advising a lot of clients on various DE&I projects. And according to its 2021 Global Talent Trends study, about 23% of organizations around the world intend on investing in DE&I analytics and insights. So what you're going to learn today really is how data can be used to inform the organization's DE&I strategy. And we have some very special guests today, which is in this webinar that's brought to you by Mercer. We have Keletjo Chiloane, who is the Senior Associate at Mercer, Lamona Rajah, who is Cummins Diversity and Inclusion Leader, and Julio Ferraz, who is our Mutual Organizational Effectiveness Executive. Thank you all for making yourselves available today. I think we can get right into it. I'm going to start with you, Keletjo, because Mercer, like I said earlier, has published its Global Trends Talent Study, which touches on this very topic. Also, you've been doing a lot of work in this space in terms of the consultations you've been doing for clients. So do you want to take us through some of the topping points and kind of shape the discussion for us? I'll stop sharing this so that you can share and kind of frame the discussion for us. Julio, I think you and I can go off cam until Keletjo is done, and then we'll get into the panel discussion.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sungula, for that intro to this discussion. It is, I think, a case in point that in South Africa, as well as the rest of the globe, really, we're seeing more and more organizations that are looking to invest in their data and specifically around their analytics that support or drive the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And the idea around this really is to develop a multi-year strategy. That is when things are done well, to develop a multi-year strategy that allows organizations to put in place initiatives and plans in order to deliver according to their diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. Now, what we are also seeing is that with the last year, right, there's been a lot of collection of data. We know that there's never been a point like the present where organizations have had as much data on their employee as they have gained in the last couple of months. Now, just to put the conversation into context around the diversity, equity, and inclusion, these are three sort of multifacets that we view the D&I conversation in, where the first element, which unfortunately is one that been focusing a lot on is in terms of driving diversity, which focuses a lot more on representation and the numbers within the organization for diverse communities. And this specifically targets in terms of how the current representation is intended to change over the next 5 to 10 years within the organization. The second element is around equity. Equity is about designing to ensure access within the organization in terms of understanding how well you ensure as an organization that the programs, the policies, and the processes deliver equality of opportunity, experience, and pay for your employees. The last one around inclusion is around fostering a sense of belonging, regardless of what background an individual comes from, in such a way that the organization has set that sense of belonging, the authenticity and trust for the employee in terms of the kind of culture and the environment in which the employee works in. Now, the question around what is driving today's DE&I environment. The first element is around social movements that we have seen globally and specifically in South Africa too, where people are acknowledging, or society is acknowledging, that there has been historic, unfortunate systemic racism, and that to some extent is still prevalent in some societies. So it's the idea that social movements such as the Black Lives Matter that did spark in the US but spread across the globe has been driving that conversation around whether or not we are addressing the issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion holistically in our organization. The second one is around gender parity. Now, this is something that unfortunately we're still a long way from addressing. Recently, the World Economic Forum released that gender pay report, or the gender parity report, that shows that it will take another 135 years in order for gender parity to be achieved in the world at the rate at which we're going. And unfortunately, this has definitely been set back even further from the 95 years that were stated previously. It has been set back by the effect of the global pandemic, which brings us to the third point, that the global pandemic, unfortunately, has impacted the historically or the disadvantaged communities, disadvantaged individuals, a lot more than it has, the general population, with specific focus to how it has impacted women specifically, in terms of just setting them back, or setting the female population really back from an economic perspective. The fourth driver is what we're seeing as the environmental, social, and governance drive, where more and more organizations are putting that front and center and saying that there's things in terms of external drivers that are driving the need to have a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment within organizations. This also includes, in some instances or some societies, where the pay equity mandate is gaining even a bigger focus, with the idea that we need to drive equity in all instances within organizations. The last element that's driving this is around the multi-generational workforce that we are seeing in a lot of the organizations, where millennials, Gen Z as we refer to them as, and other employee groups are coming in with a different expectations towards the environment in which they're coming into the organizations need to be. Now, these are things that we are seeing as driving the DEI conversations, and sort of from a more internal and to a large extent external drivers of that. Now, unfortunately, what we see is organizations externally, and perhaps as a response to all the external drivers that I mentioned earlier, they say that they stand and they support equality, justice, and equal respect for employees within the organizations. However, often internally, they don't put into place systems that ensure or solve for equality of opportunity, of experience, and of pay for the entire population or the entire workforce. Now, what we're also seeing is that this came out from our Let's Get Real About Equality study, where 81% of organizations globally say that they are focused on improving diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, only 42% indicate that they have a multi-year diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. Now, this is a concern because it does speak to that misalignment where organizations say they are doing one thing or they say they are placing emphasis on one thing, but in terms of the way that they develop their strategies or the existence of initiatives, it's something that to a large extent skews that focus. And unfortunately, this is something that we are seeing within organizations and where we're seeing globally, where that aspect of a well thought out, evidence-led, multi-year diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy is just not in place for some of the organizations that we engage with. Now, the idea here is that it's time that we bridge the say and do gap in the diversity and equity and inclusion conversation. And some of the ways in which organizations can do this is through the effective use of analytics to help solve this gap. Now, in our global talent trend study, the question that we asked around what technology do organizations say they are looking to invest in order to improve the employee experience, 45% indicated that they are looking to invest in technology in network analytics technology or technology that enables them to do that. While 38% said they plan to improve their pay equity analytics, where 31% said that they already do have or they do already provide the pay equity analytics. Now, at face value, these numbers, one might think, it's over a third in all the instances. But when you put it into context to say where we know that the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation is at the moment, that there's a lot more that organizations can do, and that there's possibly a lot more investment that need to be put in place. Now, what we thought I'll do at this point is to just talk through what some of those tools in a little bit more details, what we refer to when we talk about the pay equity analytics and what our view of that and approach of that could be, as well as some other tools or analytic approaches that can be taken. Now, pay equity is a state really of getting equal pay for equivalent work that someone or that employees do within the working environment. Now, it is the pay analytics tool, the pay equity analytics is a way that can help conduct analysis using robust statistical approach. And again, this is not requiring that organizations use data that they don't have. Organizations do already, in a lot of instances, have this data, but it's a question of identifying a formalized process for remediating any pay inequities that are coming out through the analysis, and to not only be transparent about such pay practices, but to also ensure that they put in place that multi-year way of solving the multi-year plans to remediate any inequities that might come through from the pay equity analytics. The next one is around network analytics. Really, what network analytics does is it allows organizations to see the degree of connectedness between diverse or various groups of employees within the organizations, and to understand ways in which these employees connect with one another. The idea here is that by being able to see the connectedness between employee group, you're able to identify barriers that might make it difficult for a diverse group or diverse population to interact or to be connected to key points or key communication points within the network. And again, this uses in most instances, yes, supported by technology, but uses data that is already within the organizations, and just being able to communicate that in a certain way and identify initiatives based on the analytics that have been conducted. The third one that I want to talk about is around what we refer to as the internal labor market, but really it's the idea that how do you identify any balance or imbalance of representation of women, men, people of certain races or ethnicity? How do you identify that the imbalance in representation across the various career levels? And how do you ensure that any unwarranted differences of talent loss or internal loss at the different career levels is well identified, and that initiatives are put in place to ensure that where there is a need to and especially on the career levels, where there's a need to address whether it be promotional challenges or it be sort of the bringing in of talent at those levels, that is addressed accordingly. The fourth and last one that I'll touch on is on workforce projections. So what workforce projections do is they are models really that estimate the composition of your future workforce, and they're able to help the organization set DEI targets to see if the objectives that they have or the targets that they have are achievable given the current or the projected initiative that the organizations have. So really the idea here is that as powerful as data can be, data alone is not enough to determine that evidence-based approach or the evidence-based multi-year strategy. That there is an element of also needing to understand within the organization what the employee voice is. And this often is done using focus groups. It can be done using the employee surveys as a starting point amongst other tools in order to listen to the employee voice specifically for certain groups or identified groups within the employee population. The other element, sort of the third leg of the stool here, is around identifying policies, processes, and programs that help engrave that culture that you then want within the organization and drive that culture forward with an understanding that none of this is possible without, great leadership that drives this and support the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, and support initiatives that are being put in place as dictated or as directed by the data and the evidence that supports such initiatives. I think at this point I'll pause and then thank you, Sungula, and then we can just have a conversation.
Thank you very much, Keletjo. I'd like to invite our panelists back on to camera for the panel discussion part of the conversation. And are you there, Lamona? If you are,
yes, I am, but I'm unable to enable my video. I think you to do it from your side.
Oh yes, I remember that. Let me see about that. There we go. Thanks. Sorry about that, Lamona. All right. The first question is for you, and I'm aware that Cummins does use a lot of data analytics to execute its strategic objectives. So, to what extent does this apply to the organization's DE&I goals?
So thank you, Sungula, and thank you for having me. Yes, workplace data is something, as Keletjo said, that all organizations have access to and are using already for talent and business processes. What we've found is historically employee surveys did provide useful information about employee engagement and satisfaction, but it may not provide a complete picture of diversity, equity, and inclusion indicators. So more organizations are starting to use diversity climate surveys or inclusion surveys for this purpose. At Cummins, data has informed the work that we have been doing in DE&I and has really been instrumental in the formulation of our global DE&I strategic framework. From the analysis of workforce demographics like gender and race or ethnicity, we've come to understand the spread of talent across our business units, across our locations and countries, and our career levels to identify the gaps. We also analyze performance and promotion distribution amongst the genders and race groups to understand how equitable our talent processes are. And analyzing these trends over time has helped us to develop the right tactics. And these tactics can range from, or have ranged from, recruiting and hiring to developing and advancing talent to retention of diverse talent. It helps, so each data point helps us to provide input into the strategies that we use. For example, if hiring talent from your underrepresented groups is not a problem when we look at our hiring trends and we look at our hiring data, but retention of that talent is an issue as we look at the attrition rates, then we will channel more efforts into the retention strategies than the hiring strategies. We also look at promotion and performance distribution across the genders and race groups. We do pay equity analysis to ensure, as Keletjo said, that the same employees within the same role are earning the same base salaries. And our leaders are really held accountable for driving DE&I in their business units as they develop DE&I action plans to achieve our organizational DE&I goals. They measure progress on their DE&I plans, which helps us to gauge how effective our efforts are at yielding the results we want to achieve. And it helps us to understand best practice as well, so we can scale that to other business units and perhaps deploy larger scale programs. As Keletjo said, we have thrived and really benefited from this quantitative data and the insights that the data has given us into what the current status is in DE&I. It helps us, and it has been helping us to track towards our aspirational goals as an organization. But we recognize at the same time that collecting voices and diversity and inclusion surveys can provide valuable information as well. And this qualitative information is a good indicator of feelings of belonging and feelings of inclusion and how employees perceive our efforts, how they perceive leadership commitment and accountability, how they perceive their peer engagement in the DE&I work. So we are currently exploring an inclusion survey so that we can zoom closer into this, because we recognize that feedback from employees shows us their experience and shows us how things are landing on the ground. So data collection has been part of our success, and it is a continuous journey, because as we understand, as we delve deeper into the story that the data is telling us, we can accurately diagnose the problem areas and come up with the right solutions.
Thank you, Lamona. Julio, I know that Old Mutual has been doing a lot of work in this space. How has the organization evolved, the one that some would say was previously perceived as something of an all-boys club?
Sure. Thanks, Agula. Yeah, that's an interesting one. And good morning, everyone. I think when diversity and inclusion is a very complex and complicated topic, because it's so weaved into the fabric of every organization. And I'm willing to bet, whether directly or indirectly, all members of this panel that's on this cause is probably doing something in the area of D&I. And so, if we look at Old Mutual and you speak about old boys club, I hope we've moved past that. But our diversity and inclusion journey really actually started from the top. We have a board that is very big on ESG, a board that is very big on inclusivity as an organization. We've got a CEO who drives D&I, ED&I from the front, and an exco that's fully supportive. So for us, really, the starting point, and I suppose it made the job a little bit easier, in that we had a leadership group that really believed in the power of diversity and inclusion, and in particularly inclusivity. One of the first things we had to really pin down is to say, well, why do we want to do this? Why is this important to our organization? What is the business imperative? And I think you can probably pursue D&I for a number of reasons, whether, if you're in South Africa, you want to adhere to certain legislative requirements that keep you in the game to do business, whether you feel or think that there's an ethical and moral obligation, or whether you think there's actual real business benefit to diversity and inclusion. There's a myriad of reasons as to why you can pursue it. For us, and really the case we built is, first and foremost, we believe that there's significant business benefits to diversity and inclusion, and particularly in the area of innovation and growth, and driving our innovation and growth strategy. We also do firmly believe that there is a moral and ethical obligation that we have as one of the larger employers in South Africa and on the rest of the, we're also on the rest of the continent. I won't say we're one of the larger employers on the rest of the continent, but we play there. That we do have a moral and ethical obligation, but it really starts with the business strategy. It really starts with the notion around innovation and growth for us. And that was quite important because it directed how we think about diversity and inclusion. And I love to hear kind of from Lamona the different aspects that they thought around talent transformation, representation, engaging with staff. I mean, that's certainly some of the things that we also thought about and are thinking about. But if we look at how we then went about saying, okay, well, how are we going to strategize around D&I and what are we actually going to drive? We went through a process of analyzing what I kind of consider quite hard data. So we looked at things such as talent, what we call talent flow. So, who's getting promoted, who's leaving, who's getting recruited, where's talent getting stuck? And what type of talent are we talking about here? Are we just talking about representation, but are we talking about mix of skill? Are we talking about, different people with different views, different opinions? So it's not only about, I suppose, and again, linking back to the notion of innovation, it's not only about representation in terms of demographics, gender, race, and so forth, but also, do we have difference in skill and thought? And I can tell you that in a company like Old Mutual, we used to, and we were quite kind of, we had quite a good view that, you hire from UCT as an example, or you hire from UJ, and people that went to certain, of course, private schools for certain roles. That was a good place to hire from. I mean, we way past that. But just to say that diversity of background and experiences is quite important. So we looked at our data analysis in terms of talent flow, pay equity. We looked at culture results as well, and in our culture results we have 2 dimensions that measure diversity and inclusion. One is, well, actually 3. Sorry, one's around psychological safety, which we believe is an absolute key tenet for our D&I initiatives. Or efforts. We've got a very strong measure around actual diversity and inclusion. So how inclusive do I feel the organization is? Do I feel like I have a place, etc.? And then we have a metric or a dimension around inclusive leadership. And, that's very much about how does the leader not only, make me feel like I have a seat at the table, but I actually have a voice at the table. And my voice matters, and I can bring myself. If I'm like wearing a suit like I do, I'm accepted. If there's someone that's more on the esoterical side and they want to wear a funky hat, that's great. So how does the leader make me feel inclusive? Because a key tenet, and we talk about inclusivity for us, a key objective is really creating a sense of belonging for everyone that works in the organization. And so we've set our North Star not only from a representation point of view, but also from does everyone actually have a sense of belonging? We understand the importance around representation, particularly in the markets that we operate. We want to represent those markets, but that sense of belonging is absolutely critical. Look, we still, I would say, I won't say in the infancy of our journey, but last year we just kind of refreshed our 5-year DE&I strategy. We've got sort of hard metrics that we look at, as mentioned. Pay, certainly one. Representation is another one. We do look at, as I said, our culture results. We're starting to look into the area of skills and skills mix. And to get that, you need the right technology, but you also need people to engage with the technology. How do you know that you've got a team filled with differently skilled individuals and people? And then, in terms of sort of the key areas that we're focusing on, I think we've kind of got the typical focus areas around gender identity, age, people with disabilities, religion, and ethnicity. But we look at, let's call it, resolving the headwinds that those groups face through 3 key areas. The one is through what we call structural inclusion, which really focuses on the processes, the policies. You now have, for example, AI coming into the realm of recruitment. And how do you build algorithms that don't unintentionally exclude certain groups? So how do you build your recruitment processes? For example, if you do have a focus on people with disabilities, how does your recruitment process cater for those that can't see or those that can't hear, that are hearing impaired or sight impaired? So these are the things we think about in structural inclusion. We've got a very big focus on behavioral inclusion. That's really around not only educating and making employees aware of how they can create an inclusive environment, but it's also about how do we nudge line managers to make the right choices? How do we nudge line managers in performance management conversations or calibration conversations around unconscious bias? As an example, when you're hiring someone, how do we nudge a line manager around, for example, pay negotiation? There's great research that says men are more inclined to be more aggressive in negotiating their pay. So these things are very real societal issues. And then we've got a key tenet around leadership inclusion, and that's how do we build leaders that A, role model inclusivity, but B, also builds a space for psychological safety. And that's been a really big drive for us. So yeah, we're still on the journey. I think it would be remiss of me to say that all 25,000 employees are wonderfully happy, have a great sense of belonging, etc. But it is a big focus for us, driven from the top and driven by some serious data.
Thank you so much for that, Julio. That's a really good, comprehensive picture. And I just want to respond to your question on the talent transformation, and you hit the nail on the head. It's not just about representation, but it's about participation. And sharing that narrative with the employees about the value of, for example, take gender, the value that females bring to the table and add to decision-making, and how you need that balance between your masculine, your feminine attributes, etc., and how it may provide a more innovative and better solutioning for the company is critical. And one of the things that we started off with in the Africa Middle East region across the different countries was looking at how women are contributing to decision-making. Because it's one thing to have, to say you've reached % representation or 40% representation, but are your females or are your underrepresented groups in the decision-making forums, in the decision-making platforms, and are they being brought along? And with that, you have to understand, as you alluded to, and Keletjo, you also alluded to, you have to understand historical inequities and how people show up in the workplace. And I think you also alluded to that, right? The social, moral case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which expands beyond the bottom line and the business case. And for many years, we organizations thought that they could get more traction and more buy-in for DE&I by saying that it helps bottom line. But we've left behind, or we were tempted to leave behind, the moral and the social case. And as you start looking at that, that's where the equity becomes very important, because you have people, and not just in my organization, but in all organizations, where there will be backlash. There'll be backlash against DE&I, because now when you start to balance the scales and provide more equitable opportunities for those who've been left behind, those who've always had start to feel like something's being taken away from them. So along with the focus on representation and participation and inclusion, I think there's a lot of work that many organizations need to do around the narrative of equity. And that touches very close personally to people, because one has to recognize their own power and privilege. And that's not an easy thing to do. I think the space that many organizations are going toward is that kind of topic, to get the buy-in and the commitment, because the last thing you want is for people to do this as a tick the box exercise. Holding leaders accountable. Sometimes leaders feel pressure. Let me just get them off my back. Let me just do this and get them off my back, But then the essence and the feeling of inclusion, the actual benefit of having that diversity in your team or at the table is not effectively leveraged. So there's so many dimensions to this, but just fantastic conversation.
Thank you very much, Julio and Lamona. I've just put together a poll for everybody to answer, and it's really about finding out the extent to which DEI initiatives are conceptualized and rolled out in your organization. Basically, how do you go about putting together your DE&I strategy? And I would just give you some time to get those results in, and hopefully we have a good balance of results there. There are some alarming responses from what I can see at the moment, but we will get to that. Keletjo, in the meantime, do you have any thoughts on what Julio and Lamona have shared so far?
Definitely. I think just one of the points that Lamona was raising now around the responsibility that leadership then holds in creating the spaces for employees to speak up when they need to. And the idea that without leadership buying into the business imperative for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or buying into why they need to have a diverse group of voices in the table, or a diverse group of voices bringing their ideas forth. Without leadership buying into that, it makes it very difficult for any organization to put into place any of the initiatives that have been identified. And as I mentioned earlier, that data alone is not going to be enough. It is a start, because it is information that is already available, oftentimes that needs to be analyzed within the organization, but that alone is not enough. The importance around identifying what more needs to come in, whether it be the employee voice coming in, or it be the idea around leadership having a strong buy-in to why we are doing this as an organization. What benefit is it to holistically, whether it be the business strategy, what benefit it is in terms of the reputation of the organization moving forward, that is important. And without that, no initiative will gain any success, really.
Thank you very much, Keletjo. All right, here the results are in, and what is very alarming is that 26% of the attendees in this conversation say DE&I is not a strategic priority for our organization, which is alarming to say the least. Just to go through the other results, 37% say we base our objectives purely on legislation and aim to hit those targets. 46%, which is the majority, say we run employee engagement surveys and use that qualitative feedback to drive our DE&I goals. And then lastly, which is kind of, I guess, is the first prize in terms of what we're discussing today, is we have tools and systems in place that we use to monitor our progress and adjust our strategy accordingly. I'll open it to the floor to kind of respond to those poll results before we get into more of the discussion. Keletjo?
Yeah. I see that one that's leading the pack there around running employee engagement surveys and using that as qualitative feedback. Look, historically, employee engagement surveys have been sort of the go-to, let's hear what the people are saying and let's put initiatives around that. But that alone is not going to be enough. Because what it doesn't always do is paint a full picture. What you're getting is a snap in time view of what your employees are saying, but not necessarily what then the full picture, whether it be promotional opportunities, whether it be the talent flow as referred to by the other panelists, that you're not seeing that full picture. And in so doing, you're not taking full advantage of what a proper multi-year DE&I strategy, a properly conceptualized one. You're not taking full advantage of what that could result in or the benefit that that could have in the organization.
Anybody else would like to comment before I ask a follow-up question?
Sure. I mean,
no, go ahead, Julio. Go
okay. I mean, what I was going to say is I'm not surprised the percentage so low on D&I not being a strategic imperative. I think a lot of organizations and just people I've spoken to fail to really sell the business benefit behind it. It comes across as a soft issue, and the challenge with that is, if you don't get that leadership commitment, now to Lamona's point, D&I, if you do it right, is a very, I would say for a lot of people, a very deeply fulfilling experience, but also a very difficult transition to go through. There's been a lot of hurts, across the rest of Africa, not only in South Africa, around a number of issues. And if you get it right, where leaders own their rank, their power, their privilege, those are very hard conversations to have. And if your leaders aren't willing to have those conversations, they don't understand the business benefit, it becomes lip service. I just wanted to share that thought.
Lamona?
Julio, agree with you on that. It is difficult, and you have to be willing to engage and expand that conversation past just the leadership to getting to employees, because often where the misunderstanding, the unintentional exclusions, or just right out discrimination happens between employees. And if we, sometimes what I find is that we're preaching to the converted all the time by focusing a lot of our efforts on the leadership. It's important, but we shouldn't leave the rest of the employees behind and seek those change catalysts in the organization that can help change and inspire others toward change. I want to follow up on what Keletjo said about the employee surveys. Employee engagement surveys, if they have been used in the format that I've seen them in the past, may not be pointed enough toward diversity, equity, and inclusion indicators. And so I would encourage those organizations who are using that to perhaps explore your diversity climate surveys or inclusion surveys, which are much more useful in understanding specific things about DE&I, right? You may be able to extract or seek for correlations between some of the stuff that you see in the engagement survey, but it may not be giving you the right diagnosis. So just be aware of that as you use old tools to solve for today and tomorrow's problems.
Can you think of an example of a difference of a question that would be in an engagement survey that would provide more insight if it in the form of a diversity and inclusion survey?
Yes, absolutely. So there are quite a few studies out there on diversity, inclusion, and equity surveys. The one that I came across recently was quite interesting. And I'll just speak about this one aspect of it because there's different categories of questions you can ask. The one category is diversity representation. So where employees get to answer questions like, I see other women in leadership. I see people from my race group in leadership. I feel like my voice is being heard. I'm involved in decision-making processes. I feel like I can express who I am at work. I don't need to cover, that whole element of psychological safety. So those are some examples of more pointed questions that can give you an indication of the DE&I health of your organization more than a broader question on how engaged you feel or motivated you may feel at work. Although that is important, it may not be the same kind of information you're getting from it.
And Julio, what do you do at Old Mutual? Do you have an alternative to surveys for kind of assessing where you are from a D&I perspective?
So yes, we do. I mean, we, as I said, we do our culture survey, but our culture survey, it's a homegrown survey based very much on some shifts we want to see in the D&I space, our values, etc. So we measure things such as psychological safety, as I said, because one of our core beliefs is if we get that right, we go a long way to helping to lay fertile ground to help solve this. But we look at other things such as maybe what I haven't mentioned is such as things as organizational network analysis. We're starting to get into that space to see which groups are connecting with which groups, how are they interacting with each other, are there individuals or teams of people that are sitting on the periphery? Do we have influences in the organization that, if we send through the right message, they can influence people? So organizational network analysis is hugely powerful, not only to see how people are interacting, but also to understand how you can influence the organization. And then a very big focus for us as well is using our employee resource groups. So we currently have about 7 of them across the organization. We engage them through, Yammer, our internal social media platform, as well as kind of face-to-face workshops, facilitated workshop. And we get a lot of feedback from that. We also do organizational listening and sentiment analysis on what people are saying through platforms such as Yammer. So you can get lost in the data. You need to have a pretty good data team behind this that can make a lot of sense of the information that's coming your way. Yeah.
Okay. Keletjo, do you have some advice on the kind of tools that people can use?
Yeah, I was just going to bring up the idea that just the point that Julio has raised, that you can get lost in the data, that it does need to be a fairly focused approach to doing it, such that as you collect the data, whether it be through the engagement surveys, which can be helpful, but as Lamona has indicated, oftentimes they're not detailed enough specifically on the D&I conversation. And so what some organizations then do is they run a survey specifically around, D&I conversations, whether it be the psychological safety, the inclusion element, and that. So that's on the survey and the collection of data from that perspective. In terms of what other ways that can be used to hear the employee voice is around, depending on the designated groups, having there's forums where you use your forums, or you use your or you use just conversations, really, focus groups, and you use those focus groups to identify any specific issues that persona grouping might have. So that's just some of the additional, to overlay the hard data that comes from the organization, to overlay it with what you're hearing your employees saying. So that's definitely something that organizations can consider in order to paint a full picture when identifying the D&I strategy.
Hey, and sorry, Lamona, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, just building on what you said, Keletjo, as you collect these voices, and Julio, you made reference to the listening forums, which is such a great thing to use as well. And I just want to caution people to be very wary of perception versus reality with the employees and the voices that you're collecting, because people are at different stages in their DE&I journey. And you may not have the kind of buy-in that you need for all your employees to move on this journey. So as you look at that data, it's important to see where do you need to go back to the drawing board and perhaps re-communicate the strategy and the need for what you're doing, anchor on both the business case and the moral and social case to kind of move people into action. You may need to go back and re-communicate. What is a common purpose? What is our common purpose? Base it in fact, base it on results and research so that you get more buy-in from people, and then have your very courageous conversations around where people are dragging their heels. And is there a place in the organization for them? Is there a better place, etc.? How do you meet people where they are, but use that information to see perception versus reality? Because qualitative data, surveys, etc., is very subjective. It's subjective information. And so as you extract the story from what the data is telling you, you need to use a lot of discretion and wisdom, and then go back to the drawing board and see what sort of change management tactics you need to use and the grounding that you need to implement. And you may possibly see from there which pockets of the business are more problematic in terms of stagnation, and which are the ones that are accelerating.
Okay, we have a question here from Kaslin, who is asking, how do you address situations where employees express their opinions openly and honestly, but line managers make excuses for the lack of progress with regard to DE&I? Julio, would you take this one, given that you guys are actually listening to your employees?
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure what the context is, but I think there's a couple of things that need to, let's call it a couple of foundational things. So first and foremost is, does your organization have a very firm stance on DE&I, and are they willing to back choices that are made? They always say a culture, one of the, I wouldn't say a culture, but one of the tenets of what defines as a culture is the worst behavior that's accepted. So, if there is bad behavior, as an example, that is accepted in respect of inclusivity, diversity and equity, is the organization willing to take action, to send a very clear message? So I think that's the one piece. The second piece, and I mean, I can just speak for ourselves. We've tried to focus a lot on creating the right environment for conversations to happen. So if it is deep and difficult conversations, take race as an example, or even gender. It's a very difficult conversation. Whether you're male or female, whether you're white, black, colored, Indian, Chinese, the perspectives are hard. And so, creating a safe container for those conversations to happen, openly and honestly, and hear different perspectives become quite critical. So I wouldn't just jump into it. And then, and maybe this has to talk to the heart of your organizational culture. Old Mutual is a very data-driven organization, and people listen to data and information. I mean, the business was built in actuaries, so we've got nerds of nerds running the business, if I can put it like that, and they listen to data and information. So yeah.
Okay, we have another one from Butle here, who is asking if there is a validated inclusion survey questionnaire available. How do people go about finding those inclusion and diversity surveys, which can be used for collecting this kind of data?
Maybe I can address that one. So as Mercer, we do have surveys and tools that are available that can be customized depending on the need of the organization and what questions or what element are they trying to address, or what concerns are they trying to address, or information they're trying to gather. So it's a conversation that you would need to have with a provider of such, and in order to build, a survey that makes sense for where the organization is at that time, and customize it to get the right kind of input or data from your employee grouping. That's definitely something that there are, surveys available that have been validated and can assist with that.
Okay, and then from Mpumelelo, she says, would you say our organizational culture is an inhibitor for psychological safety, or a precursor to safety being authentic? Lamona?
Sorry, say that again.
She says, just say that organizational culture is an inhibitor to psychological safety.
It depends on the organizational culture. So some organizational cultures are historically authoritative or hierarchical, depending on the industry that you're coming from and the history of that organization. For Cummins, the organizational culture is one that is very caring. So care and caring is actually one of our core values, along with diversity and inclusion. And so caring for employees, creating an open space, even when there are performance issues with an organization, whereas I've worked for other organizations in the past, and it's very, in and out culture, performance driven, you got to deliver. Whereas what I experience that's different with Cummins is you will get asked the question, what's going on for you? Are you okay? Like what's going on for you that's making you show up in this way, and seeking to understand. And one of our leadership, Cummins leadership values is coaching and developing talent for success and empowering all employees' potential. So there's a lot of walking that path that goes, and I think depends on that organizational culture, the core values of the organization, the organizational culture, which can either be an accelerator or an inhibitor of psychological safety. But there's two parts to psychological safety. A lot of people think that psychological safety is just speaking up, expressing your thoughts, sharing ideas. The other part to psychological safety is how safe do you feel to share dissenting views from the popular in the room, and also raise difficult issues. That's the real test of psychological safety. And a lot of people kind of just look at the one aspect of it. So it depends on the organization, and that kind of call to action should be coming from top leadership. It really helps when you have that commitment from top leadership.
All right. And the last question, I suppose, is from Linda. And she says she would like to hear more from the panelists about what challenges they're experiencing within the DE&I context and how they are addressing them. I don't know who would like to touch on something that hasn't already been mentioned. I know Julio spoke about, data can be overwhelming, and it's very difficult to, get what you need when you have so many different types of data available, and how do you choose what to focus on? I think that's one challenge, but any other challenges that we haven't touched on already? Keletjo? You're on mute.
I think for me, it's that issue around accountability in terms of who is being held accountable for the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And understanding that, Lamona raised the point that it's not just for the leaders, the ones with the title of leadership, but rather to say that you need to be held accountable at all levels in the daily interactions, and to identify what matrices at each of those levels, or what targets, what key indicators at each level of the organization would the individual be held against in order to support the DE&I strategy, that it cannot just come from one office alone, that it needs to permeate throughout the entire organization. And that's often a challenge in terms of having those initiatives stick, and ensuring that really genuinely the culture of the organization does change.
Okay, anything to add from any of the other two panelists?
I think I'd like to just zoom in there. I know we're out of time, but one thing that I really struggle with is this whole myth of the zero-sum game. And it alludes to what I spoke about before, where people who we're used to getting the opportunities now feel like opportunities are going to be taken away because you are focusing on equity. And that there's a lot of people who just don't say it. It's covert, it's not an overt thing. But this whole myth of a zero-sum game, that if you're giving to someone else, you're going to take away from me, because people think of a pie as a standard, rigid, 8 pieces. Whereas with what diversity, equity, and inclusion is supposed to do for businesses, grow that pie to 24 pieces, 36 pieces, more for everybody. So that's something that definitely is a challenge, I think, in the DE&I work.
Yeah, Julio, closing thoughts?
No, look, I mean, I probably won't add to the challenges. I think it's multi-layered. Every organization has its cross to bear, if you like. But yeah, I think maybe the important thing is to start somewhere, because it is a big pie to bite off, and so. I think it can be one of those things that's a little bit, I won't say disheartening, but if you think about it, there's a lot to get done. And so it's just to start small, start somewhere, really tap into your employee base, because a lot of the times they've got great ideas around how you can solve some of the D&I challenges within the organization.
Fantastic. And on that note, I'd like to, bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate you bringing, making yourself available, sharing your insights. To everybody that has attended, thank you as well. I think it was a very helpful conversation for those that do care about DE&I. I was disappointed to see that it's not a strategic imperative for many organizations, but I guess that's where we are, and conversations like this work towards changing that. So thank you all for coming through, and we'll see you soon for the next one. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.